execution by cannon fire, historically known as blowing from a gun. In this terrifying punishment, a doomed captive was strapped directly to the barrel of a loaded cannon. The moment it fired, the person was obliterated in a split second. A 19th century British soldier left behind a gruesome eyewitness account of the aftermath. He noted that the victim's head would rocket 40 to 50 feet straight up into the sky. Their arms would be blasted high into the air in opposite directions, landing roughly 100 yards away, while their severed legs simply dropped to the ground beneath the cannon. Despite how violent it looks, this method actually ranks pretty low on the list, because the blast wiped them out so fast, the victim likely never felt a single ounce of pain. The Brazen Bull. This giant metal statue was actually a terrible punishment. A person was locked inside, and a fire was lit underneath. As the metal got extremely hot, the victim inside would slowly burn alive. This was done in public to scare everyone. The creepiest part was how it was built. Special tubes inside the head changed the victim's screams. To the crowd, the cries of pain sounded exactly like an angry bull roaring. Smoke would even blow out of its nose to make it look completely alive. Aztec live heart removal. To appease their sun god, the Aztecs would stretch a sacrifice across a stone altar. A priest would then slice open their torso using a razor-sharp obsidian or flint knife. Reaching inside, they would violently rip out the victim's still pumping heart, holding it high into the air as a bloody offering to the heavens. Bastinado is a form of punishment where the victim is struck on the soles of the feet using a thin rod, stick, or whip-like instrument. Unlike harsher forms of flogging, its main purpose is to cause intense pain rather than immediate serious injury. However, if applied with excessive force or continued for too long, it can still lead to lasting damage, making walking extremely difficult or even impossible in severe cases. Despite its cruelty, it is generally not considered a directly deadly method. Hanged, drawn, and quartered. In Old Britain, this was the worst punishment for men who betrayed the king. It happened in a few brutal steps. First, the guilty man was tied to a wooden board and dragged by a horse to the execution spot. Next, he was hung by the neck, but taken down right before he died. While still awake, he was cut open and his insides were pulled out. Finally, his head was chopped off and his body was cut into 4 pieces. These body parts were hung up in famous spots like London Bridge as a bloody warning to everyone else. Blood Eagle. In this brutal ritual, the victim's ribs were cut from their spine and bent outward to look like wings. Then, their lungs were pulled right out through their open back. This caused a very slow and painful death. It is a quick story, but easily one of the worst punishments in history. The agonizing torture of the rack. A victim was strapped to a wooden frame where ropes violently stretched their arms and legs apart. The pressure caused unimaginable pain, easily popping joints from their sockets and shredding ligaments. While it was mostly used to force confessions out of prisoners, torturers could simply keep cranking the machine until the captive's limbs ripped clean off, leaving them to bleed to death. Poena Cullei. It was an ancient Roman punishment for those convicted of killing their own father. The condemned person was reportedly placed inside a leather sack along with animals such as a dog, snake, monkey, and chicken. The sack was then sealed and thrown into water, carrying out the execution in a symbolic and ritualistic way. It reflected how seriously patricide was viewed in Roman society. Keelhauling. This was a very harsh punishment used by sailors at sea. A person would be tied to a heavy rope, thrown in the water, and pulled completely underwater from one side of the ship to the other, passing right underneath the bottom of the boat. The bottom of the ship was rough, sharp, and covered in rust. If the person somehow didn't drown or die from being badly scraped across the wood, the crew would simply drag them under again. They would keep repeating this horrible process until the sailor finally died. Because it was so cruel and painful, sailors were absolutely terrified of it. The Choke Pear. This brutal iron instrument was inserted into a person's mouth or rear end and then mechanically forced to open up. The goal was to painfully stretch the area so far that the tissue completely tore and could never be repaired. Glasstration. This method did not always kill the victim, but it is one of the most painful things you could imagine. A thin glass stick was pushed inside a man's private parts. Then, the torturer hit the stick with a hammer. The glass would smash into tiny, sharp pieces, completely tearing him apart from the inside. Flaying. This was a brutal punishment where a person's skin was peeled off while they were still alive. The goal was slow, unbearable pain. Because removing the skin doesn't cause rapid bleeding, the victim would not bleed to death quickly. Instead, they stayed completely awake and felt everything. They would suffer for a very long time before finally dying from shock or an infection. The torturer had to be highly skilled. They did not want to cut the skin off in small chunks, but preferred to remove it perfectly in one piece. To make this horrible process easier, they would sometimes pour boiling water over the victim to loosen the skin first. The sickening castor oil barrel torture. To force a confession, captors made a victim chug huge amounts of castor oil, triggering agonizing cramps and explosive diarrhea. The deeply sick person was then locked inside a human-sized barrel until they finally broke down and talked. But if the captive stubbornly refused to cooperate, the punishment reached a horrific extreme. They were simply left trapped inside to drown in their own bodily waste. The horrific March of Basil II. After capturing 15,000 Bulgarian soldiers, Emperor Basil devised a twisted punishment to send a message to their homeland. He grouped the prisoners by the 100 and completely blinded 99 men in every single squad. The 100th man was left with just one eye, simply so he could guide his devastated comrades back home. When the Bulgarian Tsar, Samuel, watched his ruined, sightless army stagger back in October 1014, the sheer horror of it reportedly gave him a massive heart attack, killing him on the spot. Scaphism. It is often described as one of the most extreme punishments in ancient times. In this method, a person was placed inside a small boat or between two boats, lying on their back, with their arms and legs left exposed. They were force-fed large amounts of milk and honey, which made them very sick, and the same mixture was spread over their body. This attracted insects and animals from the surrounding area. Over time, these creatures would gather, feeding on the body and causing severe harm. Each day, the process was repeated. More food was forced on them, and more of the mixture was applied, keeping the person alive while extending the suffering. Some accounts claim this could go on for many days, with the body slowly breaking down in the open. These stories, whether fully accurate or not, are often used to show how cruel punishments could be in the past. The Catherine Wheel. In this gruesome execution, a victim was strapped to a massive wooden wheel. An executioner then used a heavy hammer or iron bar to completely shatter their limbs. Afterward, the wheel was hoisted up for public display, leaving the broken victim hanging there to slowly starve to death. The Spanish donkey. For this torture, the victim had to sit on a sharp-pointed block of wood, just like they were riding a real horse or donkey. Then, heavy weights were tied to their feet. These weights constantly pulled them down, digging the sharp wood deeper and deeper into their body. The pain was terrible, and eventually, the heavy pull would slowly split the person completely in half from the bottom up. The rat's cup. Traced back to Emperor Nero, this brutal method involved strapping a bowl of starving rats to a victim's stomach. A fire was then held to the outside of the bowl. To escape the blistering heat, the panicked rodents had only one option: chewing straight through the person's flesh. And it gets worse. A gruesome South American variation called the rectoscope used a tube to force live rats up the victim's backside, leaving the trapped animals no choice but to literally eat their way out through the internal organs.